Welcome to the My Bird story.
And a warm welcome back to you. Today, we're opening up our study note for a deep dive into, well, a really pivotal story from Genesis, the separation of Abram and his nephew Lot in chapter 13.
Yeah, it's a story packed with lessons, isn't it? Not just about, ancient family issues, but some deep spiritual truths that still speak right to us.
Absolutely. Especially for those of you serving in ministry, we've got some fascinating insights from our sources to unpack here.
Okay, let's jump in. Let's turn to our study notes, starting with Genesis 13, verse 1 from the NIV. So, Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev with his wife and everything he had, and Lot went with him.
So the text says Abram went up from Egypt. The Hebrew is wa'ala. Now, our study notes suggest this isn't just geographical, moving from the lower Nile Delta up to Canaan.
Right, it feels like more than just travel.
Exactly. Many scholars see this as symbolic, maybe even a spiritual ascent. It's a deliberate reversal of the going down, the Yarad, to Egypt back in chapter 12.
So it's like moving back towards where God called him, maybe after that. Difficult time in Egypt, a return journey in a couple of ways.
That's a great way to put it. After that whole episode where he presented Sarai as his sister, for self-preservation, returning to Canaan, the promised land, and heading back towards those earlier worship sites, it marks a real turn. Our notes highlight this as potentially part of a spiritual restoration.
Okay.
And crucially, verse 1 right away mentions Lot going with him. And not just Lot, but everything he had, all his wealth.
So Lot's benefiting from sticking with Abram, but all that stuff they both have, that's immediately flagged.
Precisely. Lot's there with his substantial possessions linked to Abram's return from Egypt with his considerable wealth.
Yeah.
It just sets the stage perfectly.
It foreshadows the conflict, doesn't it? The material problem that's about to happen because they just have too much for the land.
You got it. The seed of the conflict is right there in verse 1.
Okay, moving on to verse 2. Abram had become very wealthy in livestock and in silver and gold.
Right, very wealthy. The Hebrew phrase is kat mashot. It means very heavy or very weighty.
Heavy?
Yeah, and what's really striking, our notes point this out, is it's the exact same root word, kachan, used back in 12:10 to describe the severity, the heaviness of the famine that drove Abram to Egypt in the first place. Karan.
Wow.
So the same word for a terrible famine and huge wealth. That's quite a contrast.
It is powerful. From crippling scarcity to immense abundance. And this wealth, especially the livestock, it's presented as a direct result of his time in Egypt, boosted by Pharaoh's gifts.
So there's an irony there. This blessing, partly gained through that ethically shaky situation in Egypt, it ends up causing the division in his family.
That's a really fascinating layer. The consequences of past choices aren't always what we expect. Sometimes, blessings bring brand new challenges.
It kind of challenges our simple ideas about cause and effect. And remember, wealth back then wasn't just cash. Livestock was key capital, status. So having huge flocks, herds, and silver and gold, their combined resources were massive.
Just too much for one area.
Exactly. Our notes really stress how this sheer volume would inevitably strain the land's capacity for grazing and water.
Okay, verses 3 and 4. From the Negev, he went from place to place until he came to Bethel, to the place between Bethel and Ai, where his tent had been pitched earlier, to the place of the altar he had made there at first. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord.
So he travels deliberately, from place to place, lamasa ayu, which means by stages, following a route he knew.
And he's heading to a specific place. Between Bethel and Ai.
Right. Not random at all. It's where he first camped after entering Canaan. And more importantly, it's where he built his first altar and called on the name of the Lord back in chapter 12, verse 8.
So it's like a pilgrimage back to a really significant spiritual spot for him, like hitting a reset button.
Our study notes definitely reinforce that idea. Returning to this specific place of worship seems like a conscious act of spiritual restoration after that detour into Egypt.
And that phrase, calling on the name of the Lord.
Yeah, that's a loaded phrase in Genesis. It means open public worship. Invoking Yahweh's name, declaring his allegiance right there in a land full of other gods and beliefs.
So more than just a quiet prayer, it's a public statement.
Yes. Our notes suggest it marks a crucial spiritual turning point. Think about it. In the Egypt story, there's no mention of him building an altar or calling on the Lord.
Good point.
So coming back here to this altar, it signifies a real effort to recenter his life on God in the land he promised. anchoring himself spiritually right where his relationship with God in Canaan first went public. It's a powerful move after wandering.
Verse 5 brings Lot back into focus. Now Lot, who was moving about with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents.
Yet the text explicitly confirms Lot's wealth is similar, substantial. Flocks and herds and tents. And our notes suggest tents here isn't just, his sleeping tent. It means his whole household.
His servants, his family, everything.
His entire operation. So yeah, they aren't just two guys traveling. They're two large, prosperous clans moving together.
Okay, so it confirms Lot really benefited from being with Abram.
Absolutely. Benefited from Abram and the blessing on Abram. Their combined scale is huge, and the text brings this up right after Abram's return to worship. It just underscores that this shared prosperity is the immediate backdrop to the problem.
The stage is definitely set for a resource crunch, which brings us to verse 6. But the land could not support them while they stayed together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to stay together.
And there it is, plain as day. The land could not support them. The phrase, to stay together, leshevet yado, it's actually repeated in the Hebrew.
For emphasis.
Right, to really hammer home the practical reality. Their possessions, especially all those animals needing pasture and water, were just too much for the area.
So it wasn't necessarily personal bad blood between Abram and Lot at this point, more like an economic reality.
That's a key insight from the notes. It seems it wasn't born out of animosity, but out of blessing. The sheer logistics of their success created the problem.
Right.
For pastoral groups, large herds needed huge areas. Grazing land, water sources, their combined wealth, a sign of blessing, made staying together practically impossible. The land just couldn't sustain both massive households in one spot.
Verse 7 adds another complication, though, and quarreling arose between Abram's herdsmen and Lot's. The Canaanites and Perizzites were also living in the land at that time.
Okay, so the notes clarify that the actual quarreling, the rup, it started between the herdsmen.
The guys on the ground managing the animal.
Exactly, competing for the limited grass and water. But then there's that crucial piece of context the narrator adds. The Canaanites and Perizzites were also living in the land.
That detail seems easy to just read past, but it sounds like it makes things much worse.
Oh, absolutely. Our sources really stress this isn't just background detail. It highlights the core issue. The land was not empty.
Right.
It was already occupied. Maybe Canaanites in the towns, Perizzites in the countryside. Some scholars suggest that kind of distinction. The point is, there wasn't unlimited space.
So that just intensified the competition for resources.
Hugely. It made the conflict between Abram's and Lot's groups almost inevitable. And it also meant that, as newcomers, keeping peace within their own extended family was even more critical for their survival and witness in a land where they were essentially guests.
Seeing this brewing conflict, Abram steps up in verse 8. So Abram said to Lot, "Let's not have any quarreling between you and me, or between your herdsmen and mine, for we are kinsmen."
Abram takes the initiative, proactively moves to resolve it. Now remember, as the elder, the patriarch, he could have just laid down the law, demanded priority chosen first.
But he doesn't.
No. And our notes really highlight how remarkable this is. He prioritizes peace, the relationship, over his position or personal advantage. He appeals directly to their family connection, calling Lot kinsman. The Hebrew literally means men brothers.
That's a huge leadership moment, especially when you compare it to how he acted in Egypt. He's putting reconciliation first here.
Exactly. Our study points out this is a different Abram than the one in chapter 12 worried about his own skin. Here, he's modeling real peacemaking. He starts the conversation, and he grounds it in who they are to each other. We are brothers.
And given the context with the Canaanites and Perizzites around.
Yes. Maintaining unity was vital. Vital for their safety, vital for their witness. He shows that the relationship matters more than the stuff they're arguing about.
And then verse 9, he makes this just incredible offer. "Is not the whole land before you? Let's part company. If you go to the left, I will take the right. If you go to the right, I will take the left."
He offers Lot the first pick of the land. Is not the whole land before you? Now, our study notes see this partly as rhetorical, acknowledging others are there, yes, but also reflecting Abram's underlying faith in God's ultimate promise of this land to him.
He's giving Lot the chance to take the best part, potentially leaving him with, well, whatever's left. That takes serious trust.
It really does. It's an act of extraordinary generosity, and it powerfully demonstrates his faith in God's provision. He's not relying on his own strategy or his rights as the senior figure, but on God's promise. He trusts God will take care of him no matter what Lot chooses.
And the left and right.
Yeah, notes often point out that if you're facing east, which was common for orientation, left would be north and right would be south. So Abram's genuinely saying, pick any direction, north or south, I'll take the other.
Okay, so let's see Lot's response, verses 10 through 13. Lot looked up and saw that the whole plain of the Jordan in the vicinity of Zoar was well watered, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan and set out toward the east. The two men parted company. Abram lived in the land of Canaan, while Lot lived among the cities of the plain and pitched his tents near Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord.
Lot looked up and saw, way you share, the Jordan plain. Our study notes point out the deliberate echo of God later telling Abram to look, but the motivation here is different. Lot's looking is all about immediate sight, material appeal, what looks good, what looks easy.
And the description is vivid. Like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt.
Yeah, like Eden, like Egypt. Sounds amazing, right? Paradise and worldly security rolled into one. But as we touched on, our notes see deep irony here.
Because it's near Sodom.
Exactly. Scholars like K. Matthews and Nahum Sarna, their work in our notes highlights this picture of lush abundance, evoking Eden and Egypt. It's incredibly deceptive because this beautiful area is right next door to wicked Sodom.
So the ideal place visually is actually bordering on profound evil.
Precisely. And that little note the narrator slips in. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. That's a clear heads up to the reader. It's foreshadowing. It tells you right away this choice based on looks. It's heading for disaster. It just exposes how deceptive relying only on appearances can be.
So Lot chooses based on that visual appeal, well-watered, and he moves eastward.
Which, as you noted, often carries negative weight in Genesis.
Right, away from God's presence or purpose.
Often, yes. Think of Adam and Eve east of Eden, Cain east of Eden, Babel moving east. It frequently signals a departure. And then look at Lot's progression. First, he pitches his tents near Sodom.
Okay, just near.
Then later, the text says he lived among the cities of the plain. And eventually, we know he ends up living right in Sodom itself.
It's a gradual slide, isn't it? Not a sudden jump.
Yes, our notes really emphasize this progressive movement towards Sodom. It's a visual of a spiritual trajectory, a path of compromise. And verse 13 slams it home with that explicit judgment on Sodom's wickedness, Re'emem, sinning greatly against the Lord. It just underscores the danger of Lot's choice, driven by sight, not faith.
But after Lot leaves, God speaks directly to Abram, verses 14 through 17. The Lord said to Abram after Lot had parted from him, "Look around from where you are, to the north and south, to the east and west. All the land that you see I will give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted. Go, walk through the length and breadth of the land, for I am giving it to you."
This is such a key moment. God speaks to Abram immediately after the separation, right after Abram's act of faith and generosity. The timing is crucial. God responds to that selfless act.
And God tells him to look around, echoing Lot's looking, but with a divine purpose this time.
Exactly. Lift up now your eyes and see. Lot looked by sight for personal gain. God tells Abram to look with eyes of faith, to survey the whole promised territory, north, south, east, west.
And the promise gets bigger, stronger.
Significantly reinforced. It's not just for his offspring anymore, like in chapter 12. God now says, all the land that you see I will give to you and your offspring forever.
To you, including Abram himself, and forever, that permanence.
Yes, our notes point out that expansion. And the offspring promise is amplified too, like the dust of the earth. Countless descendants. It's this huge reassurance right after Abram seemed to give up the best part. God's showing him, my provision is way bigger than what Lot took.
Oh, then there's that command, go walk through the length and breadth of the land. That sounds like more than just, taking a walk.
Oh, definitely. Insights from scholars like Gordon Wenham and K.A. Matthews suggest this carries real weight from the ancient world. Walking through a piece of property back then could be a kind of symbolic legal act.
Like formally taking possession.
Yes, confirming ownership, especially when it's granted by a higher authority, like a king, or in this case, God himself.
So God's saying, actively claim this land I'm giving you by walking it.
Precisely. It's a physical enactment of the promise. Abram is to walk through this land, which is still full of other people, performing this symbolic act of possession as an expression of his faith in God's word. For I am giving it to you. It makes the promise tangible through his obedience.
And finally, verse 18 shows Abram's response. So Abram moved his tents and went to live near the great trees of Mamre at Hebron, where he built an altar to the Lord.
Abram obeys. He relocates, settles near Mamre at Hebron, a place that becomes really important later on. And, just like he did at Shechem and Bethel earlier,
He builds another altar.
he builds an altar to the Lord, yes.
Yeah.
And our study notes interpret this consistent altar building as more than just private piety. It was a public act.
Right, like claiming the land for God.
Exactly. Dedicating it to Yahweh right there amongst the Canaanites and their shrines. It's a visible declaration of his faith, his allegiance in the land God promised.
Planting God's flag, you could say.
That's a good way to put it. And it stands in such stark contrast to Lot, who's moving towards Sodom, a city known for its wickedness against God. Abram establishes markers of God's presence. Lot gravitates towards human depravity.
Now, our study note dives into some really fascinating scholarly perspectives that just enrich our understanding here. These aren't just dry academic points. They really illuminate the meaning for us. You mentioned earlier the description of the Jordan Plain as like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. Our notes dig into that irony.
Yes, that phrase in verses 10-13 is just so packed with meaning, and as we discussed, it's deeply ironic. Insights from scholars like K.A. Matthews in the New American Commentary and Nahum Sarna in the JPS Torah Commentary, they really highlight the literary skill here. It paints this picture of incredible fertility and security. Eden means paradise, Egypt means worldly power, agriculture, security from the Nile.
So on the surface, it's the perfect spot for someone like Lot with lots of livestock, easy living, comfort.
Absolutely. Yeah. But the irony, as these commentators underscore, is just profound. This beautiful, seemingly perfect place is right next to Sodom, a city about to be obliterated for its wickedness. It's such a powerful illustration of how worldly appeal, material prosperity, can be just a facade.
Hiding spiritual danger underneath.
Exactly. It warns us that what looks best to our natural eyes, what seems most advantageous from a purely earthly viewpoint, might actually be spiritually toxic.
It's a challenge to look deeper than the surface.
Right. To consider the spiritual environment, the associations. Lot's site-based choice, picking this place without thinking about its spiritual context, leads him to deep trouble. It's a stark contrast to Abram, who finds blessing by trusting God's promise in the less glamorous but spiritually significant hill country.
Another insight, you mentioned scholars like Gordon Wenham in the Word Biblical Commentary discussing God's command for Abram to walk through the length and breadth of the land in verse 17.
Yes, and that's fascinating because it connects the Bible to the wider ancient Near Eastern world. Wenham and others suggest this command might reflect an actual ancient legal or symbolic practice, where physically walking across a piece of land was a way to formalize your claim or take possession.
Especially land granted by a king or here by God.
Exactly. So when God tells Abram to walk the land, it's not just, hey, go check it out.
It's much more significant.
For Abram, in his culture, this command would feel like a tangible act of receiving the divine grant. God says, I am giving it to you, and then tells him to do this symbolic action. It's a concrete, physical expression of his faith in God's promise. He's walking the boundaries, step by step, claiming the land based on God's word, even though other people live there.
It makes the unseen promise real through his obedience, that link between faith and action.
Precisely. It transforms the promise into a lived reality for Abram and makes his faith visible. He's not just sitting back. He's actively, faithfully inhabiting the promise God gave him.
Now, this whole dynamic between Abram and Lot, it feels very intentional in the story. Our notes talk about Lot serving as a foil to Abram.
Yes, scholars like Bruce Walke and George Coates use that literary term foil. A foil is a character whose story or traits contrast sharply with another character, making the qualities of that second character stand out more clearly.
So Lot's story isn't just like a side story. It's there to help us see Abram's faith more clearly.
That's exactly the idea. Lot's pattern, choosing based on sight, immediate benefit, picking the nice-looking plain near Sodom, is a constant counterpoint to Abram's journey. Lot's choices lead him into danger, needing rescue by Abram in chapter 14, then by God in chapter 19, and even then he suffers loss.
Right.
That whole trajectory of compromise and consequence really highlights the wisdom and the eventual blessing of Abram's very different path, a path of growing faith, trust in unseen promises, and willingness to sacrifice immediate gain.
It's like a cautionary tale woven into the main story of faith.
It is. Lot's path warns us against worldliness, against choosing only by sight. And at the same time, it magnifies Abram's developing character as our model for living by faith.
Pulling these ideas together, it seems there's a really strong message here about the connection between, well, where we are physically, who we associate with, and our spiritual condition.
That's a key takeaway our study emphasizes, highlighted by scholars like L.R. Hillier. Lot's physical movement going east, getting closer and closer to Sodom. It isn't just about changing location. It powerfully symbolizes his spiritual drift. He's literally moving away from the heartland of God's promise towards a place defined by his wickedness.
So his geography mirrors his spiritual state.
Exactly. Abram, on the other hand, stays in Canaan, the land of promise. And what does he do? He keeps building altars, dedicating places to God's worship and sovereignty. He's anchoring himself, his household, spiritually in the place God called him. The point Hellier makes, and the story shows, is that our physical environment, the places we choose to live, the communities we join, the associations we keep, they can profoundly shape our spiritual well-being. It's not just a practical decision. It has deep spiritual implications.
Okay, as we think about Abram and Lot's separation and all these layers in Genesis 13, there are definitely some powerful applications for us today as believers, and maybe especially for those in leadership. Let's explore how these ancient truths hit home now. One big one is how Abram handled that conflict.
Yeah, Abram's response to the fight between the herdsmen in verses 8 and 9 is just such a valuable model, especially in the church. He didn't let it fester. He didn't wait for Lot. He stepped in proactively. And like we said, he didn't pull rank.
No, he chose reconciliation, the relationship, over his own position.
Our notes really stress his focus on harmony. Let's not have any quarreling, for we are kinsmen. That's such a critical lesson for pastors, for elders, for anyone navigating disagreements in a congregation or between ministries, or even just personal conflicts.
It means prioritizing peace, appealing to our shared identity in Christ.
And sometimes, yeah, yielding our own preferences or even our rights for the sake of unity in the body, being the first to seek peace.
So how can pastors really model that kind of sacrificial peacemaking and teach it?
Well, it starts by living it, doesn't it? And preaching it. Using examples like Abram to show that real strength in leadership isn't always about winning or being right, but about sacrificing for the health and unity of the community. It takes humility and really valuing those bonds of faith.
And that connects right into that core choice we saw. Choosing between seeing from a worldly view, like Lot, and living by faith, like Abram.
Lot's choice, based only on how nice the Jordan plain looked in 13.10, is such a powerful warning. He went for what looked comfortable, prosperous, secure like Egypt. And that's a constant pull in ministry today, isn't it?
Definitely.
Churches, leaders, we can get drawn towards chasing worldly signs of success. Big numbers, fancy buildings, impressive budgets that can look like the well-watered plain.
It's easy to start using the world's measuring stick instead of God's.
Exactly. And it's such a contrast to Abram's faith in God's unseen promises, trusting God would provide even in the less flashy hill country. Discerning choices based on faith means asking different questions.
Like, is this decision driven by obeying God's leading, even if it looks risky or unpopular?
Right. Or is it driven by what looks materially better or easier by the world's standards? Pastors have to guide their people and themselves to look through the lens of faith in God's word, not just through the lens of sight and worldly appeal.
And Abram's willingness to sacrifice, letting Lot choose first, God met that immediately with an expanded promise. There's a huge lesson there about trusting God's provision when we sacrifice for him.
That's one of the most encouraging parts, I think. God shows up right away, reaffirms the land promise, adding to you and forever, and boosts the descendant promise right after Abram acted so selflessly and faithfully. Our study notes really underscore that God sees and honors faith when it's expressed through sacrifice.
So, when pastors or any of us face situations where putting relationships or obedience first means giving something up, maybe a perceived advantage, this story reminds us God is faithful.
Faithful to provide in ways that often far exceed whatever we might have sacrificed. It's a truth we really need to grasp in ministry.
Yeah.
God's blessing, his provision, it often shows up unexpectedly when we prioritize his kingdom, the gospel, and relationships over our own gain or comfort. It encourages us not to hold earthly things too tightly, but trust that God's plan and provision are far more secure.
Lastly, Lot's slow drift towards Sodom. That feels like such a critical warning about environmental compromise and getting tangled up with the world.
It really is maybe one of the most direct warnings from this passage for us today. Lot's path shows how subtle compromise can be. It started just pitching tents near Sodom, 13.1. Maybe it was convenient, better grazing, easier access to trade.
Seemed harmless enough at first.
Right. But that seemingly small step led to living among the cities of the plain and then eventually living in Sodom itself. It wasn't a sudden leap, it was a gradual slide.
A slow creep towards danger.
Exactly. Our notes highlight this incremental slide into worldliness. Small compromises, letting worldly values, entertainment, associations seep into our lives, our families, our churches, because they look attractive or convenient like that well-watered plain, they can slowly lead to deeper entanglement with things hostile to God.
So it's a call to be vigilant.
Absolutely. A critical warning for pastors and believers. We have to be really aware of the environments we choose, the influences we allow in. We need to consciously choose places and associations that foster godliness and protect us from that subtle but powerful pull towards spiritual compromise. Building good boundaries is essential.
Okay, as we wrap up this deep dive into Genesis 13, let's quickly recap the main points. We saw Abram's return from Egypt, maybe a spiritual ascent, but also bringing back wealth that created tension.
We saw his intentional return to the altar at Bethel, re-anchoring himself spiritually, and the conflict arising from resources made worse because the land wasn't empty.
Then Abram's amazing response, prioritizing peace, generosity, trusting God over his own rights.
Contrasted with Lot's choice, based purely on sight, leading him east towards the danger of Sodom, a picture of spiritual compromise.
And crucially, God meeting Abram immediately after his sacrifice with an expanded promise, commissioning him to walk the land in faith. Plus, Abram's consistent altar building.
Yeah, all these points offer such powerful lessons. Handling conflict God's way, choosing faith over sight, trusting God's provision and sacrifice, and guarding against that slow drift into worldly compromise.
So as we finish up, here's something to think about. Lot chose based on what looked good to his eyes, the lush plain, but it hid deep evil and led to loss. Abram chose based on faith in God's word, giving up immediate advantage, and God met him right there with an enduring promise. How does this challenge you to really examine the criteria you use for making big decisions in your life and ministry? Are you drawn by the appeal of the well-watered plain, or are you resting on the solid rock of God's promise?
And building on that, especially for those in ministry, think about those pressures we all feel for visible success, numbers, stability, the things that can look like that attractive plane. How do we make sure our choices for our churches, our families, ourselves are truly rooted in faith, in obedience to God's leading, even when it means letting go of what looks easy or appealing right now? How do we actively protect ourselves and those we shepherd from that subtle drift towards compromise that Lot's story warns us about? What practical steps, like Abram building altars, can we take maybe even this week to intentionally, publicly, personally set apart our lives, our ministries, our spaces more fully for God's sovereignty and witness in a world that's always calling us to look somewhere else?